Hello, my name is Wendy Garling, and I have written this book, Stars at Dawn, Forgotten Stories of Women in the Buddha's Life. This book is actually a new biography of the Buddha, and it was inspired by my own personal journey, first as a Buddhist practitioner and also as a scholar of early Buddhism. And my question was, is it really true that we know all that there is about the Buddha's life? Because it seems as though the biography that's normally told about the Buddha is pretty bare bones. It's just about him and his own quest for enlightenment. So my question was, what about the women in his life? What about women in early Buddhism? Not necessarily the nuns, but the women who knew him as his mothers, for example, and his wife, the women who knew him in his family and before he became the Buddha. So I jumped into a lot of research, several years of research looking at the early Sanskrit and Pali sources, some of which had been translated already into other languages and cultures, for example, Tibetan and Burmese and so forth. But I was looking for stories of the Buddha that we were unfamiliar with. And over the course of several years, I found many, many stories. It was quite a delight. And I found a tremendous number of stories of the women in the Buddha's life. So that's what gave rise to this book. And it, to me, adds quite a lot of new material and certainly a very rich layers to what we know about the Buddha. These are stories that make him more human. I think it makes Buddhism more palpable, more real when we see his own family life, his own struggles and so forth. And it also gives me a sense of empowerment as a woman and as a Buddhist practitioner, because I realize that women were very much integral on the path to the Buddha's own enlightenment. They were participants, they were players in very important ways and in surprising ways. And they all had their own aspirations for spiritual realization also, I found in these stories. For example, normally we don't hear much about the Buddha's birth mother, but I found many stories. And in these stories, we learn a lot about her before the birth. We do learn that indeed she died at the time of the birth, which is the traditional account. But we also learn that in the imagination of ancient India, she lived on as a goddess and remained an active participant in his life as a concerned mother. And she becomes more of a goddess figure. But the theme of motherhood remains very vivid in some of these biographies, which was a total surprise to me. I also learned a lot about his stepmother. Many of us have heard of Gautami, who became the first Buddhist nun, but I learned a lot about her in my research, and now it's in this book, about her as his mother. And she was a very, very loving mother, and the relationship was very deep, and some of the stories are very, very moving of her in his early years, when she was really the only mother he ever knew. I also learned a lot about his wife, Yashodhara, and a lot of questions came up around his marital status. And that was a big surprise, because in some of the sources, it was very clear that he had a large harem. And it was typical of the time that princely aristocrats had not only harems, but multiple wives. So in the more complete, I would say, versions of his life story, we learn that he had at least 3 principal wives. And there were many, many harem stories. There were often just very beautiful stories of women. They weren't what we might think of as sort of the negative, sort of over-sexualized stories of harems. They were, in fact, beautiful stories of women's voices and women's collective, really, living together. And I found that a very powerful aspect of the Buddha's life. And this was a very powerful part of his early life before he left home and eventually became enlightened.